Today on episode 138 of the Moving Forward Leadership Podcast, we bring on Dr. Michael Colburn, and he's going to tell you how you can learn how to motivate yourself and become a self-manager so that you can go ahead and achieve great heights with your career. That's right, folks. It's all about you mostly here today on the Moving Forward Leadership Podcast. Are you ready for this? All right, let's do it.
Welcome to this episode of Moving Forward Leadership. Stick around and learn how to achieve, excel, and become a leader that people willingly follow. Lead, don't boss. And now, here's the host of our show, Chief Leadership Officer, Scott McCarthy.
Welcome all to the Moving Forward Leadership Podcast. Yes, it is your Chief Leadership Officer, Scott McCarthy, and welcome to the podcast where we focus on the three domains of leadership, and that is leading yourself so that you can hit that peak performance that you want to as a leader. 2, leading your team so that you can build high-performing, cohesive teams. And then finally, 3, leading your organization so that you can achieve that high organizational output. For some of you, it's profits. For others, it's votes. For others, it's something else. Regardless of what it is, that organizational output, here at Moving Forward Leadership, we cease to maximize it by taking world-class guests like Dr. Michael Colburn and bring them together with my 20 years of military experience and smash it together to bring you the best podcast on leadership going today. And it's so great to have you here. And it's so great to be talking to you about this topic that I'm really passionate about, about leading yourself to be a better leader. Because if we don't lead ourselves, how can we really lead others? It's like that old analogy. When you get on the aircraft, they do the safety briefing and they tell you in the event of cabin depressurization to put your mask on first before helping others. And you know why they tell you to do that? Because if you pass out, there's no way in hell you can help put someone's mask on for them. And that's what it's all about here, Moving Forward Leadership and leading yourself and under that domain. It's all about getting that mask on first so that you can turn around and help others get theirs on. So it's such a powerful topic. But before I dive into today's guest, I do have a quick announcement for you and something that I'm excited to say. So I'm going to make something easier for you, and that is getting questions to me. So if you go to movingforwardleadership.com/question, you're going to be brought to my SpeakPipe account where you can go ahead and record a question. And you know what? Record a great one. I'll throw it up on the air and I'll answer it for you. So again, go to movingforwardleadership.com/question. And that's going to bring you to that webpage where you can go ahead, record right there from your computer, from your phone, from your tablet, whatever you're using. And I will throw it up on the air and answer it for you. So don't be shy. You got your leadership questions. I am dying, absolutely frothing at the mouth to answer these things because this is what I love to do. This is what gets me going at the end of the day, in the beginning of the day, to be there and help you develop your leadership skills. All right. So again, movingforwardleadership.com/question. All right. Dr. Michael Colburn is the president of Colburn Associates. It's a professional service firm whose mission is to assist organizations to implement healthy change and learning that will help them achieve and sustain improvement in total performance. He's been a change agent for more than 30 years, working with a broad range of clients in private and public sectors. He's helped develop and implement services to support leadership, processes improvement, and organizational development. These services include strategic execution, performance advancement, workforce development, systems improvement, and leadership development. And the cool part is that I really liked about this interview with Dr. Colburn is that he shows how leading yourself actually will impact the greater organization. And we get through this and we go through this and we talk about not just leading yourself, you the leader, but how to instill this into everyone in your organization, all your subordinates, all your directs, and how you can go ahead and develop a culture of self-management, and it's super cool. So you know what? That's enough for me. So why don't you sit back, relax, and enjoy this interview with Dr. Michael Colburn. Michael, welcome to the show. It's so good to have you here finally.
It's great to be here, Scott. Really enjoyed that you asked me.
No, pleasure's all mine, sir. So one of the first things I like to do at the podcast is basically get the guests to give a little background about themselves, who they are, where they are, how they got to where they are today, and basically establish your street credibility, if you know what I mean.
Sure.
So why don't we start from there?
Sounds good. Well, I started off, I'm an industrial and systems engineer. I got my degree from Ohio State University. Worked in industry for a number of years, 10 years, and started out as an engineer. Then I got into engineering management, really enjoyed it. But there's a certain time I said, I really want to go out on my own. So I went out on my own, got a consulting practice, kind of evolved over the years. My niche really turned out to be working with closely held companies, anywhere from $10 to $100 million. Although I did work with some other types of organizations, but that was kind of my niche. Really enjoyed it, got involved, went back to school, got a master's in industrial and system engineering and business, then went on to get my doctorate in adult education. So I kind of went from the left side of my brain to the right side of my brain in my educational experience. And really that's really when I started integrating the industrial engineering and the leadership in one package. Then I had an opportunity when I was getting my graduate work at Ohio State. They offered me to pay my way if I would teach some courses. And I taught first in the industrial engineering department. And I really liked the teaching. And then when I went on to get my doctorate, although I was out of engineering, I did my research in industrial engineering, really the education of an engineer. And I had a lot of interest also in self-directed learning. So that really transformed my consulting business. Then I had an opportunity, which was great. I was offered a position as a visiting professor at a university in Ohio, Ashland University, to teach both undergraduate and graduate classes in a business school. And that was kind of the last 10 years of my formal career. And that was such a great opportunity because I was able to put everything together, loved working with students, and also love learning with them. And I found that all my great professors always were learning with me, and I found that I was really stimulated by my students and learning lots of things about them. So that's kind of the professional part. I am married. I have 4 grown children. I have 3 stepchildren. One passed away. We have between us a dozen grandchildren. I love to play tennis. We've gone to the U.S. Open and we went over to Wimbledon. We love to watch tennis and play tennis. So it's a good life.
Wow, that's a super interesting story. Definitely, for someone in the hard engineering world to end up in the essentially adult education. And
right.
You don't hear that too often.
No, every time I take any of the assessments about what job you should be in, I never come up as an engineer. Although if I had to do it all over again, I would clearly start with engineering. I'm really good at mathematics. I think I'm very good at diagnostics, and I think it really helped me to learn discipline, and I think problem solving but integrating it with the more human side really made it much more powerful for me. So I tell people sometimes I accidentally made the right decisions in my career because when you're 19, 20 years old, you're not always sure what you're going to do, but it turned out to be a good decision for me. I wouldn't have changed it for the world.
Absolutely. Definitely appears that way. And it's interesting that you mentioned discipline because I think that's going to come up in today's show as we dive deeper and deeper.
Great.
So we're talking about self-management today, and you've written a couple articles on that topic. So first off, I want to go into for the listeners out there is like, what do you mean by self-management in the first place?
Yes. Well, self-management is the ability and the will to act in the best interest of the organization in such a way that intrinsic motivation replaces any need for external consequences to reward or punish behavior. That's kind of my short definition. And after I wrote some articles and I taught courses in self-management, I ended up writing a book. And that was my project after I retired from my teaching position.
Interesting. So when we boil down to it, definitely that discipline, definitely having that drive and motivation to, do the best thing. And it's interesting you mentioned that not having these common motivators, having those essentially, it feels like removed from the equation. Why is that so important? Why does that actually matter? Because you hear a lot of people saying, well, you need to motivate your people. You need to take care of your people. Give them pay raises, give them extra time off, give them this perk, that perk, all this. But I feel like you're kind of saying no. Like the best way.
Yeah, I am saying
none of that matters.
Well, it matters in a different way. I find that people should be paid well and get raises and bonuses and all those things, but I don't call them motivators of performance. Those are reward for performance. And I think so. For example, if I'm working and I need someone to give me an external consequence to do a good job, then I've kind of given over control to them about my destiny. I love to have great bosses when I worked. I loved to have great professors when I was going to school, but I wasn't going to let the quality of my boss affect the quality of my work. I would prefer a good one. And I think that for that, I think people have this strong intrinsic motivation to work. And I think organizations need it because, they should reward their people well. They should, but I don't call that motivation. I think I don't call myself a motivator. I help people, I believe, find their own motivation. And that is much stronger and much more lasting than external sources.
Definitely love it. I couldn't agree with you more, especially at the end there. The fact that when we get more internally motivated, it doesn't matter because all those other things are just, cherries on the top or, sprinkles or even to the point where like, I don't care. It doesn't matter to me. It's that internal drive, that internal dedication, that internal will to achieve what you want to achieve.
Absolutely.
Now, with that, what are some, do you have some guiding principles out there that will enable people to say, okay, sounds good. This sounds great.
Right.
But I kind of need a framework to work with. I've been kind of slumping here. I'm not really motivated per se as a person overall. I need a framework, something to guide me, to help me get from where I am today, where I become this self-managed machine that takes care of things.
Yes, I've discovered working and leading at times 5 fundamental principles of self-management. And here are the principles. And the first principle of self-management is I work for the customer. I don't work for my boss. I might be accountable to the boss, and there's a working relationship with the boss, but my job is to serve the customer. And sometimes the customer for a particular job may be an internal customer as opposed to an external customer. So I'm supporting other people in the organization who supports the external customer. And that's in opposition to I work for my boss. I think we work for the customer. That's the fundamental piece. It's a belief system that I think is a foundation. The second one is I manage my own performance. I accept that responsibility myself. It's not my boss's job to manage my performance. It's hopefully the boss will help support a person, but they're not there to manage performance. And that goes to the third principle, which is a natural one from the second one, is my boss and I are partners in performance. That strong relationships are collegial. And what I've found, Scott, is the behavior of the job holder impacts the direct boss much more powerfully than they think. And sometimes we get the boss that we accept, and so by self-managing, that relationship becomes more collegial. And I've asked people to describe their best boss at times, and almost always that collegiality kind of surfaces to the top. The fourth principle is I am loyal to the truth. If I'm going to be self-managing, I need to be loyal to the truth. And I think accountable people are loyal to the truth. And when we're loyal to the truth, some people might think that's risky, but I have found that I'd rather to be loyal to the truth. If I made a mistake, I'm the one that brings it up, and then we use that, and that changes the relationship with the boss also, because it's my job to manage my own performance. And therefore, I'm going to be loyal to the truth. I mean, I'm going to make very clear commitments. I'm going to follow through. I'm going to take the responsibility to follow through on my commitments and report on progress, good, bad, or indifferent. And that's a very powerful principle. Then the last principle, the fifth principle, is I'm a lifelong learner. It's my job to continue to grow. Today's good is tomorrow's fair, right? And today's great is tomorrow's good. So we need to continue to grow. And it's great when the organization provides opportunities. But when I was taking my adult learning courses, over 90% of learning is more self-directed and informal. Nothing wrong with formal workshops or classes, but most learning happens in a very informal way, and it's much more powerful when it's self-directed. So that's kind of my framework.
I really like it. I especially like the last part in how you put it, in that most learning is informal and self-directed. And the reality is that's one of the reasons why this podcast exists. I felt like, okay, I need to learn more. However, I felt stuck, and it ended up going, why don't I just make a podcast and interview great people like yourself and learn from your knowledge, vice going out and buying books and only getting what the author wants me to get out of it. Instead, now I'm on the question side. I get to ask the questions that I want to know the answers to and get the knowledge from you. I also really like that power to truth. Mm-hmm. And too many leaders out there, I feel like, and bosses out there don't either cover their eyes, kind of like a young kid. We were talking before we hit record here, how I have a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, and if they don't want to see something, what do? They cover their eyes. Well, it doesn't negate the fact that what they're trying to not see still exists, still there. You're just not seeing it.
Right.
And how many times did we hear of that? Oh, who's got the bad? We got the bad news. Who's going to bring it to the boss? Well, I ain't going to bring it to the boss. Are you going to bring it to the boss? I don't want to bring it to the boss.
Right.
And then it's like, hey, boss. Okay, well, here we go. Here's the news, and people kind of shun away and go, I don't believe that. That can't be true.
Yeah. When I'm working with an organization, and typically I work with a CEO or top leaders in the organization, one of the first things I do before we even get into an engagement together is I will ask the leader, and I said, so if I find that you're doing something wrong that's inappropriate or it's not helping us move forward, how do you want me to tell you that? And I get that out on right on there. He says, how do you want me to tell when you're doing something wrong? And so we talk about that before it always happens, and then they always know that I have something to give them. If I walk into their office and I said, so would you like some feedback? Are you open for some feedback now? Well, of course they know what's going to happen, right? And if they roll their eyes, I said, well, if you're not ready for it, we can talk some other time, Well, of course they're going to ask for it. Then I'll come in and I'll give them honest feedback. But we can do that when we set that up front. If we wait till the incident, it's harder to do that with the boss. So I find the same thing with teams. I work with teams a lot, and there's still leadership in teams, but I have them develop protocols with themselves. How are we going to deal with performance issues? How are we going to deal with communication? How are we going to deal with that? And I have them develop protocols, and then the protocols manages that relationship instead of the one person being the bad guy, And I find that's very powerful. And quite frankly, I find it actually strengthens team relationships, does not weaken them, much like honesty and openness with the boss strengthens that relationship with the boss. And so it just seems to be the most natural thing to do and set those protocols up early.
Awesome. Love it. Love it all. Now, that's a framework. That's a framework for someone to use. Now, for the person listening, and they go, okay, sounds good. Got this framework, but how do I go about doing it? What are, I see what you're saying, but how do I start going about implementing this so that I become, more self-manager, a self-manager of myself, so better self-manager?
Well, I teach 5 different tools. And let me share the first one, because the first one is kind of the granddaddy of all tools that I think it gets at what you're asking. And the first tool is the performance agreement. And a performance agreement is different than a job description. A job description is used to kind of look at the characteristics and look at the overall responsibilities. And it's really developed by the organization. But for an individual to be more self-managing, I have them develop a performance agreement. And let me give you some of the steps that we do that helps that. First thing I have them do is to identify who are your key relationships. Those are the people that you might report to, a level up, might be people that level down, it might be teammates. And I have them go out and I have them interview their key relationships within the organization. And I have them ask 4 fundamental questions. First question. So, in my job as industrial engineering manager, I'm using that as an example, what am I doing well? What am I doing well that's creating value for you right now? And it kind of takes them back, and ask for specific examples. And I find by asking that, they're not only telling you about you, they're also telling you about them, about what they pay attention to. So that's the first thing. And also, it's a strength-based approach. And let me tell you what question I never ask. I never ask what's not working. That comes later in a different form. Here's the second question. So if I'm an accountant, so what are your needs and expectations for me in my role as accountant for this firm? That is the one that gets the most answers. And what happens, they start talking about things. And then we look at different categories of things. So I might say, so in the area of financial reporting, would you explain that a little bit more for me so I can understand what you mean? And then they'll ask questions about measurements. So if I'm doing that well, how will you know that I'm doing that job well? What are the indicators of success? That's the second question. And that's the question that takes the most time. Third question is we take all the things they said in question number 2 and we zero in on the performance measures. How do I know, what am I going to do to demonstrate accountability to meeting these your needs and expectations? And then the fourth question is, so what can I do more of, better, or differently to perform? And sometimes people say, well, no, you're doing a good job, Michael. Do anything, keep it doing it. I said, no, I really mean, what can I do more? It might not be a problem I'm having. It's just maybe I have a strength that I haven't been using quite as much. Those 4 questions, and you ask those with a whole series of people around you, is all the information you need to really start to develop a good performance agreement. Then I also have them assess some of their own strengths. This is a very strength-based approach. What do you do well? Maybe it might be some instruments we do. And out of that, I show them how to set goals around those needs and expectations, and then make those goals public, public to your boss, public to your key relationships. So what you're doing is you're putting yourself on the spot, and then you're gonna take the responsibility on a regular basis to report on your own progress. So you don't wait for that annual performance review to do it. You make regular reports. So I say, Scott, here's what I've done this last month. Here's where I'm going. I'm making progress here. I'm falling behind on there. And what that does, it puts you in position of my boss to be a coach and helper, because you are not the deliverer of the performance assessment, directly. So that is, I find if people make it through and can work up those performance agreements, they have already set up a system of self-management for themselves.
There definitely requires a lot of trust with that, though, right? A lot of trust between yourself and the people that you're asking those questions to, whether that's your subordinates, your peers, your superiors. It's almost kind of like a modified 360, right?
Yes, it is. It's very similar to 360 in terms of who you talk about. 360s typically are used to look for developmental opportunities to grow. And that's that fourth question, but it's a little bit more specific than a typical 360 by asking about what are your needs and expectations. It asks not only past questions about what I did in the past, it's much more future-oriented than it is past-oriented. So I think it digs in a little bit deeper than a typical 360.
Yeah, I definitely can see that for sure. And back to my original point about requires a lot of trust. So I assume the best way is that you're making the assumption that a leader is been ingrained into their team, their organization for some time. Now, if someone shows up new to an organization, does that change, or is it basically the same type of framework that would be involved?
I would use pretty much the same framework. Matter of fact, I find that if you're new to a job, you may not be able to ask the first question about what do I do well, but you can ask the other questions. And I have to tell you, I've done this with hundreds and hundreds of people. And sometimes they're, especially if they're new on the job, they are a little afraid, because they're kind of exposing themselves, right, to what the other person will say. But I have to tell you that the response people get is very positive, because it's almost it takes people back that people are asking those types of questions. So if I'm asking you those questions and I'm reporting to you, or I'm just a teammate of yours, and that I'm sincere in asking the questions, that is a very strong relationship building activity. And relationship building is key to trust building. Now, and so in that sense, I find it a sometimes a scary thing, but it's also a trust building thing. And I found it's very impactful. Quite frankly, when I'm working with an organization who are developing strategy, I have them use the same questions. They go out and ask the customer, so what are we doing well? What are your needs and expectations for us? How can we create value for you? How do you know how do I know when we're doing a good job, and what can we do to improve? It's the exact same questions. And it always has a very strong relationship between the external customer and the organization. And this is just the internal customer and the individual. So it's a very parallel to a balanced scorecard.
And along with that, obviously humility is a huge part of this, right? You got to be humble. You got to be able to, one, asking the questions, as you point out, is a big deal.
Yeah.
Two is listening to the freaking answers.
Right. And you can't fake that, and because what happens is if you have to be open to listen. And so when I train people how to do this, I have little sessions with them, and I basically, that's the point, is I tell them, when you ask a question, even a person asks answers a question in a way that you don't think is accurate or even reasonable, I always say, here's the only answer you give. Thank you very much. It doesn't mean that everything you're going to get, you still have to put it together and look at your strengths and look at your core responsibilities and things like that. But you never argue with anybody, and you always listen. And if you're really listening to understand, that comes across to the other person very strongly. It's not as risky as some people think. It's more risky not knowing.
Valid point. Love it, actually. Because, again, it goes back to that whole, hands over to eyes, not looking, right?
Right.
Not looking at what's in your face. And
right.
If you don't ask the questions, the answers, you will never know.
And the other part, what I tell people also when they're doing this, and I've helped so many people do this performance agreement, very often when you go back and then you negotiate with your direct boss on, here's how I see my job based on these interviews. And one of the interviews, of course, with the boss. And then very often, particularly if you see some changes in your job, then you're in a negotiation piece. So you still have to get the boss to prove it, but you come in with facts, you come in with information, and you come in with a sincere desire to do a good job. It puts you in a pretty good position to negotiate in a very win-win way. And I find that it's pretty impactful for the boss as well as the subordinate.
Sometimes you have goals, but you know what? You have a hard time reaching them. And you just can't figure out why. Why is it that you can't achieve those things that you want to achieve? Maybe it's dedication. Maybe it's motivation. Maybe you haven't picked the right goals. So this is where I was not too long ago. And then I realized something. I've been developing the Power Goals program my entire life. And here it is now for you, where you can learn how to pick the right goals, figure out how to achieve those goals, how to stay on track, but most importantly, how to get back on track when you get off. So are you ready? Are you ready to up your game and achieve those things that you've been meaning to achieve for so long now? Simply go to movingforwardleadership.com/power and learn more about the Power Goals program and achieve everything that you've been wanting to achieve. And now, back to the show.
So we've gone through this. We sat there. We've gone through your principles. We've realized now, okay, there are some areas where I need to do better. I've gone out. I've used your tool of asking those 4 critical questions to some subordinates, some peers, my supervisor. Heck knows if I'm in a super big organization, maybe some of my supervisor's peers that I work with occasionally.
Right.
I've asked this big wide net. How do I go about taking this information now, analyzing it without getting analysis paralysis, and figuring out some ways forward? Whether that's goals or things I need to implement or things I need to sustain and keep doing?
Good question. So what I do, once they get that information, and also they've done some self-assessment of their own strengths too. That's part of this. So it's information from outside and also information from inside. I teach them how to do a content analysis. And so we take each one of the questions and we look for themes in it. So I teach them how to do themes. This is where looking for patterns. And it's amazing how many patterns that are much more consistent, even though each interview seems like it's very idiosyncratic. They always find patterns. So you don't have to spend, a lifetime analyzing it. And what I have found, Scott, is a typical job, they find 4 to 6 key result areas out of those interviews. And then what I have them do, and while they're doing this, I always send them back to their direct manager and saying, here's what I've learned, to get feedback from them, So they're doing this, and they might even do some trusted key relationships. They might go back in terms of doing that, so that to make sure they're on the same page. And then what I have them do is, so if you're a leader, people might be individual development of your people, might be technology areas, might be productivity areas. Then I have them write a commitment statement, an overall goal for each one of those key result areas. 2 or 3 sentences, no more than that. And out of that, they can discover performance measures, and then they start developing more specific goals to achieve those commitments. And so now we're kind of narrowing that information down from all these interviews. We have a massive information, and I'm getting it down to key result areas, and then commitments, and then performance measures. And that drives the goals. And so I coach them through that process. Sometimes I'm doing it one-on-one, and often I'm doing it in a group setting in terms of doing that. I've taught classes on it. And of course, my book was written to kind of coach people through that process.
Super interesting stuff. And the reality is, as you think about it, it totally makes sense, right? You're basically taking a large amount of information, bringing it down, seeing common themes, seeing things that pop out at you, and determining, okay, this is where these are good things, these are bad things, these are things I need to do. Let's make some goals out of this. Let's look at how we can measure them, how we can move towards obtaining them.
Right.
Now, one of the things that people hook up on, especially as they are starting off and not necessarily being a great self-manager, is that accountability piece.
Right.
The piece of doing what I said I was going to do. Now, how do people get through this hump? I feel like, and personal experience, is that at the beginning, for some people, they're really excited and they go, but then they hit the middle section and they kind of lose their traction because they're no longer motivated due to the excitement from the beginning. Other people are hard to get motivated at the beginning and don't necessarily do what they say they're going to do. So how important is this accountability piece, and what should leaders go out there who are looking to drive their self-management skills higher? Should they look for individuals to hold them accountable, or is there other ways that they can do it, kind of with themselves? What are your thoughts there?
Well, if I'm working with an organization and the leader wants, they really buy into this whole process I mentioned to you, I always tell them, well, why don't you do it first? I always take them through it first, and to work through that. The other thing is, this might sound strange, but it isn't, I don't think, is when I work with an organization, particularly who really wants their people to be more self-managing. Self-managing is not just something frontline people do. It's people throughout the organization has to learn to self-manage more. Your title doesn't give you a dispensation. And so I'll teach as high as I can get. But one of the things I always tell the organization is never make this mandatory. Now you can make performance mandatory, and some people are more open to self-managing than others, right? And so make it an opportunity for people to do it, because I'd rather help people who want to be self-managing more than the people that need to be self-managed, and I find that the peers tend to sell it out better than the boss would do it, because they see they're making some progress or taking control of their own job. So that's one thing. The other thing is for the accountability. Once you set up the performance agreement, it doesn't sit on a shelf, right? And come back a year later to see how you're doing. One of the tools that I teach, I call it the priority feedback system. It's really proactive communication with the boss. So I teach the person to have regular meetings with their boss and share what their priorities are for a period of time. And typically these meetings are spaced out anywhere from 1 to 4 weeks apart, in which I, based on my performance agreement, here are some commitments I'm making over the next month, and so you make clear commitments to them. it is the individual who runs the meeting, not the boss. The individual sets the meeting up with the boss. They agree on a general agenda for the meeting. And during those meetings, they give their short-term goals that are going to lead up to the long-term goals. And they run the meeting. And at the end of the meeting, they give the notes for the commitments for the next period of time to the boss, and they're doing that. So they're putting themselves on the spot right out of the chute. And what I found is that the boss loves these meetings because they're not the one who has to run it, and the fact that the people are coming in with their commitments. Now, the boss' primary role in these meetings are, number one, to ask questions. So, Scott, why did you pick that particular priority for the next 2 weeks? What was driving you there? Or I might say, I think that's your number one priority. I'd like to have you think about that being number two, because something just came up that I really need to have you work on. So they negotiate back and forth in terms of things like that. And so the boss has a role in it, but they're not driving the bus, but they're giving guidance at that time. And it's much easier for them to give guidance when the person is self-managing, And then the person so the next meeting, the boss has a copy of their commitments, and then they have a report on how they did that. And that's a continuing meeting that they have on and on. Now you can realize what impact this is going to have on performance appraisal. The person, in my view, can do their own performance appraisal because they've been reporting on a regular basis to the boss about their commitments. And also they will go to some of their key relationships and maybe do a similar thing with their commitments to them. So if I'm a person and I'm serving one team in the organization I don't necessarily report to, but they're my customer, I might have these meetings from time to time, not necessarily every 2 weeks, but might do this on time to time, just to make sure that we're on the same page.
That doing your own performance appraisal is probably the most difficult exercise one can go through. I've done that a couple times, and it's so hard because you're right. You should have a good, solid idea of how you're operating, especially if you have that solid relationship with your supervisor.
Right.
But you don't want to come across too cocky. At the same time, you don't want to downplay the things you've done and the potential you hold.
Yeah, the thing is, Scott, what happens is if we're having these regular meetings, then first thing, there's no surprises when you get down to performance appraisal. And
don't disagree. Don't worry.
Right. First thing, I am not a fan of traditional performance appraisal. I think in most organizations, it's a waste of time, where they have these generic terms: quality of work, quantity of work, getting along with people, all those types of things. Those are developmental issues, but the performance appraisal it's the job of the job holder is to report on their progress on all their goals for the year. Mm-hmm. And I have them do a super kind of proactive meeting with their boss once a quarter, saying, here's where I'm going, here's what my goals for the year, here's where I'm at. And sometimes they renegotiate things at that time, because sometimes things change. And so they're having these maybe weekly or biweekly meetings, and then quarterly updates on the performance agreement. So when they get down to their performance year at the end of the year, I don't even call it a performance appraisal. I call it performance review and planning. They spend more time planning for the next year, and they're going to review the year before. Here's the goals I met. Here are the things I achieved. Here's some things where I fell short, because I'm being honest and loyal to the truth. And that is a much stronger developmental things. I find managers hate to do performance appraisals for people under them, very often. And I find this thing here, when the job holder takes the lead on it, it changes that whole process around. Now, here again, I'm saying that everyone is maybe not quite capable of doing that, but those that are, I think the organization needs to let them run, let them go. And since you're having communication on a regular basis, it gives the boss or the manager an opportunity to give guidance and coaching, but it's driven by the other person.
I'm just going to throw in a quick little story here. So when I was a senior captain in the Canadian Army, I was a operations officer for one of our training centers. Not physically a big place, although we were spread out a fair bit, but a lot of pieces. We ran about 3,000 students through 300 different courses per year.
Oh,
And
wow.
myself was responsible to coordinate all these courses along with their requirements to ensure they had what they needed to run. So I was in charge of the cell, small cell, 6 people, six of us total. And at the end of the year, we do our performance appraisals, or what we refer to as the personnel evaluation reports. And I said to the 3 of the most junior ones, I said, all right, this year you guys are going to do your own PERs. Now, I'm not saying you're going to get what you're writing, but I'm putting you through the exercise so that when you get subordinates down the line, this is not going to be the first one you've ever done. And oh, by the way, doing your own is the most difficult one you will ever do.
Right.
And then when we debriefed them on their actual ones, they showed up with the ones they wrote. And we laid both of them side by side. In all 3 cases, all 3 were within, I would say, 98%.
Wow.
Of accuracy between the 2. Only a handful of little minor differences, point wise. And again, it goes back to that consistent communication, that consistent feedback, having that culture of being able to walk in saying, hey, this is what's going on. This is what I'm planning on doing. All these different things. And as a leader, doing minor adjustments on the fly as you move forward. So really shows it works for sure.
Sure does. Yeah, that's a great story.
So, Michael, before we wind down here, is there anything that we're missing? Obviously, I don't know what I don't know. So, am I missing something here that that should be covered for the listener before we start winding this show down?
Well, the question I get, Scott, is self-management for everybody?
Oh, that's a great question. That's something I never even thought of. See, that's why I'm happy why I asked mine.
Yeah, and I'm going to here's my short answer. My short answer is I believe the vast majority of people are capable of self-management, but I believe everyone is not ready for self-management. And there are a lot of things that will affect that. That's why I would never tell an organization to have everyone use all my tools, at least right away. Sometimes we have to kind of work our way into it. I did some research in my graduate work. And this was before I wrote the book, but it was when I was developing some of the tools of self-management, mostly tools around goal setting and time management in an organizational setting. And what I found was I was doing a lot of training and coaching people and using these tools. And some of the people would come out, and after they went through I had a 5-week session of a couple hours a week, they'd come out and it was just life-changing for them professionally. And then some people came out completely frustrated. and I said, wonder what's happening. I don't think I'm much different in either with both those people. And then I did some research, and I found that there are certain job characteristics that are more open to self-management than others. And there was a lot of research done years ago on this by Hackman and Oldham. And there's a thing called the Job Diagnostic Survey. And here's what I learned. If people have a job that they believe has high task significance, and task significance is, I'm really doing something of value. I'm making an impact. When that's high, they're much more open to self-management. The second characteristic was autonomy. If a job allows a reasonable amount of autonomy, mostly in the method of doing work. Now, you can think of some jobs where they have more autonomy than others. For example, typically a mechanic has high autonomy because people don't know what they're doing. As an engineer, I had high autonomy because I knew I had tools that I knew that boss didn't. So autonomy in work methods is very important. And the third thing is feedback, natural feedback. I don't mean feedback from people, but by doing the job, you know how well you're doing. So, for example, I have a friend who's an artist. Well, he doesn't have to tell people when he made a mistake, so those three characteristics plus internal growth need. And all internal growth need is how much a person sees their job as an important part of their personal satisfaction and motivation. When those four items are fairly high, it's that person will eat this stuff up. If they're pretty low, what I tell the organization is we may have to come up with different tools than I have. Some of the tools will work, some of them won't. Then I might even explore the idea, is there opportunity or is there a need to enrich that job? And we may go into a job design process to increase those characteristics that I just mentioned. And I find there's a very high correlation between both performance and satisfaction when we're able to move those characteristics up a bit. So I typically will have people take this assessment before they even get involved in the course or into the program, and then and use that as a guide to help them to work their way through and help me modify maybe some of the tools to make it more realistic for them.
That makes absolute sense. You basically got to be in the mindset for this. You can't just say, "Oh, I'm going to do it willy-nilly."
Right.
It doesn't work that way, right? You got to be
dedicated. It doesn't work that way at all. And I think that people who are, and it's okay for someone in an organization, for example, if you have a person who's right out of college and are still, or maybe into a new job, they may need a certain period of time just learning the basics of that job, and then after they've learned the basics, then we might work with them in terms of doing some things. And I have 5 tools, but I don't necessarily teach all the 5 tools right off. That can be overwhelming. Some of the tools are very open, like goal achievement, the proactive communication with the boss, their learning plans. Those things you can work with an awful lot of people. The performance agreement, the one that I mentioned to you before, typically that might need a little bit more of a job that will enable them to exercise more judgment than maybe other people might have. And so some jobs are more open to it than others.
Awesome conversation today, Michael. I truly appreciate it. We're going to start winding down now, unfortunately, though, although I feel like we could talk all night on this topic. But before we wrap up here, I do got the last couple questions for you.
Sure.
And that is one question that I ask all the guests here moving forward leadership is, according to you, Michael Colburn, what makes a great leader?
Well, first thing, a leader is chosen by their followers. They're not appointed by anybody. You can be appointed a manager position, but your followers, people that you will influence, are the ones that will tell you if you're a leader or not. So that's the first thing I would say. And then following on with that is leadership is not a title. Leadership is an attitude of service, character, and personal responsibility. So that's how I would frame the term leadership. But I have found, let's talk about maybe some of the top leaders or people who are in a formal leadership role in the organization. Here's some things that I've seen and even been a part of with some of my clients. I'm going to tell a story or two. I was working with this general manager of a very large distribution center, and I was doing problem-solving training for some of their people. And so he and I would meet from time to time because we'd set up projects for them to work on and doing things like that. And I remember early on in our conversation, this was really a good person. He said, Michael, I have an open door policy, but no one ever comes to see me. And I said, well, Joe, have you ever walked up to your office? It's first thing, it's on the second floor. You walk down this long aisle, and then you go into your office, and you have this big mahogany desk. That's pretty frightening to people, So I said to him, if you want people to be open to you and talk to you, you're probably going to have to go to them. And that's about all I said. So I was working with this organization for several months. And towards the end of this particular project, he came up to me and he said, Michael, I found out what my job is, a general manager. And I said, is that right? What is it? He said, my job is to remove obstacles from people's performance. So when he was walking around the shop, he would walk up to someone at a piece of equipment and ask this question. So what's an obstacle to your performance, and what can I do to help remove it? And he said it was amazing. People, first thing, were telling him things that he didn't know, and they were giving him good ideas. And to me, that is one of the things of a great leader. You have to listen, you have to ask questions and respond, and you're really treating your job holder as a customer, and that's critical. I had another client who, it was a construction company, and he did this on his own. He went out every week and would take lunch to a crew. And he said, the price of this lunch is I want you to each give me one idea I can do to improve this company. He did that every week. He would go to a crew. He would start with the external crews that people were out in the field, and then he did it with the internal crews, the people within the office. That was such a powerful process. And first thing is that people gave him great ideas, but you can imagine what that relationship between that leader and the people were. So he was a president. He didn't have to be appointed president, but he was appointed leader by the people on those crews. The other thing is, so those are the two things that I've noticed. I'm going to have one third thing I'm going to say. You've heard of David Thomas, who was founder of Wendy's, and he started a company, and it grew to quite a large firm. They're housed here in Columbus, Ohio. And when he was alive, he required, if you were an executive for Wendy's, you had to spend 1 day a month going to a Wendy's store, in a restaurant, and working that store. Not watching people work, flipping burgers, cleaning tables, doing things like that. That was a requirement. He wanted never to lose sight of his internal customers. And sometimes organizations, when they grow, they can kind of lose sight of that. And he'd have them work it. So I have, from time to time, I was working with this plumbing contractor that was growing very fast, and I was helping him get over that edge of growing. And I said to him, so Ron, when was the last time you plumbed a job? Because he had a plumbing certification, and he had done it for years. I said, I think it'd be a good idea. Why don't you just go out and work on a crew from time to time? And it means you're on the crew. You're not managing the crew. You're just on the crew, And he told me he did that. And one of the times, one of his people came up to him, put his head in the door, and they said to him, Ron, welcome back. So I find working the job of the people so you keep in touch, listening to them, asking them questions like these first two examples I gave you. Those are the most powerful things I've seen in terms of being true leaders with them. And they learn an awful lot about the company and about their people, and they build a very strong bond and a culture in their organization. And those people just would work very hard for that company because they knew their boss, the leader of that company, really cared for them and listened to them at that point.
So no offense, but that's got to be the longest answer ever for that question on this podcast. But at the same time, it was jammed packed of great things.
Thank you.
So hence why I'm obviously not going to cut it out. And I really like the last example, and I'll tell you why. As a platoon commander, a young platoon commander in charge of 80-odd soldiers and a couple hundred pieces of kit, I drove every type of piece of kit we had. So whether that was buses or tractor trailers, special equipment, changing oil on our heavy refuelers and all that stuff. Why? So that I have an understanding when the guys came to me and said, hey, we need new tie-down chains. I understood what the heck a tie-down chain was and why it was important. Oh, it's important because they don't want to lose their load on the highway and accidentally kill someone.
Right, yeah.
So it just, all that stuff is absolutely crucial as a leader to
you betcha.
Do that. The final question of the show is, how can people find you? How can they follow you? How can they be part of your journey?
Well, I have a webpage, www, and I'll spell this out, MichaelColburn PhD.com. And that has information about my book. And also I have some blogs on it. Might be interesting. If they want to email me, my email is dr.mjcolburn@gmail.com. I would love to hear from them and send them any information they might like to have. So that's how you can get hold of me. And then my book is on Amazon. It's called Own Your Job, 5 Tools for Self-Management in the Workplace. And in that, it's a very practical book. It takes people through all the 5 tools that I teach, as well as kind of the fundamental principles behind it so they can understand the tools. So any of those things would be great. And appreciate the opportunity of sharing that.
Awesome. And for the listeners, always, it's easy. Just go to movingforwardleadership.com/138. And all those links are there in the show notes for you. Michael, again, it's been an honor. It's been a pleasure to have you out. Definitely lots of great information in there for the audience.
Thank you very much, Scott. I've really enjoyed the conversation. It was a lot of fun. Helps me think a lot too.
All right, that's all I got for you fine folks today. I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope you enjoyed the interview. And most importantly, I hope you got something out of it. And if you did, remember R squared, S squared, right? Rate and review the show so that it gets a little bit noticed a bit more. But most importantly, I can help more people because that's what I'm here for. That's what my guests are here for, is to help more people become better leaders and not being bosses, right? So remember that. R squared, rate and review. S, share the show. Share this show with someone who you think can relate to the podcast as a whole and today's topic. And then finally, subscribe. Subscribe so that you never miss another episode. And you can do that via your podcast playing app of choice through movingforwardleadership.com/subscribe. That's it for today, ladies and gentlemen. And as always, stop bossing and start leading. Take care now.